For nearly 4 centuries, Rome ruled Britain. Tribal lands gave way to cities, roads, bathhouses, forums, and frontier walls. Its mines supplied precious metals, while legions from across the empire settled there, raising families beside the forts they once garrisoned. Yet Britain earned a reputation unlike any other province. Many lands rebelled against Rome, Gaul, Judea, and Hispania among them. But Britain produced emperors. Again and again, commanders stationed on this distant frontier proclaimed themselves Augustus. Clodius Albinus, Carausius, Magnus Maximus, and Constantine III all launched their bids for imperial power from Britain. It did not rebel more often than other provinces, but when it did, it rebelled for the throne itself. Welcome back to the Kings and Generals channel. In this episode, we explore why Roman Britain played such a vital role in the struggle for imperial power.
This video is sponsored by you. Unfortunately, the YouTube environment is not great right now, with the algorithm being friendlier to drama and react channels, and YouTube being permissive of AI slop. We don't do drama and we don't do AI, but thanks to our members and patrons, our channel continues to make 3 public videos per week, with the team intact and going strong. In recognition of their generosity and contributions, members and patrons receive 2 additional exclusive videos each week, and access many other perks. Join them to watch more than 250 exclusive videos covering every era of history. Join them by scanning the QR code on your screen, via the links in the description or pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video.
Britain produced imperial claimants in disproportionate numbers relative to its economic importance. Why did a remote, windswept island that was economically inferior compared to Egypt or Asia Minor become such a fertile ground for imperial ambition? The answer lies not in any single rebellion, of which there were many, but in the structural forces that allowed those ambitions to take root. Geographic, military, political culture, incomplete integration, and the oft-discussed psychology of distance. Britain was not merely rebellious, it was inherently predisposed to revolt. If Britain's geography and militarization made rebellion possible, Rome's political system made it probable. Perhaps one of Rome's greatest miscalculations was its lack of a fixed law of succession. Emperors named heirs, adopted sons, and elevated co-rulers. But legitimacy ultimately rested on one decisive factor: the army. When an emperor died without an overwhelming consensus, the question asked by the senatorial class was not who would rule next, but who could secure the loyalty of the legions. In this system, each imperial death created a vacuum that could seriously threaten the empire's stability. And Britain was uniquely positioned to be a key contender. When news of an emperor's assassination or battlefield death reached the island weeks after the event, Britain's legions faced the same problems as their continental counterparts. Instead, the governor in Britain could reasonably argue that he was acting in the empire's best interests by preserving stability before chaos reached the island. Britain lay at the extreme edge of the Roman world. Communication with Italy could take weeks, sometimes longer in winter. In political terms, distance translates into autonomy. Orders were delayed, reinforcements slower still, and in times of crisis, Britain was often last to know and the last to be aided. As a result, the distance between Britain and Rome, the central political hub, had 3 significant effects. The first is that Britain's command was left largely self-sufficient. Governors and military commanders operated with unusual independence. With 3 legions stationed there for much of the Principate, Britain was one of the most heavily militarized provinces of the empire. A governor in Britain commanded more troops than many emperors did at the moment of their accession. The second aspect was information lag. Particularly during the chaotic 3rd and 4th centuries, news of imperial deaths or civil wars traveled slowly. A general in Britain could plausibly claim legitimate claims to the throne before the wider empire even knew what was happening. The third was psychological isolation. Roman elites considered Britain to be the edge of the world. A misty, half-civilized land that constantly rained and did not produce anything of value. Serving a posting in Britain could feel like exile. Ambitious commanders might see imperial power as the only way out of their supposed ostracism. Additionally, Roman emperors feared two things above all: concentration of military power and ambitious generals. Unfortunately for many, Britain had both. For most of the 1st and 2nd centuries, there were at least 3 legions stationed in Britain, occasionally more. The auxiliary forces that supported these were also garrisoned in large numbers, mostly cavalry, to adapt to Britain's vast coastline and hilly terrain. Cities like Eboracum and Deva functioned as massive military hubs, while the forts along Hadrian's Wall, like Vindolanda, were entire settlements of military families. The reason for such a large force for such a seemingly small part of the empire lies in the risk to Britain. Britain, while mostly peaceful under Rome's control, was actually unstable. The conquest was never total, and the continuous rebellion of the northern tribes and Scotland's failed conquest highlighted a sore point for Roman power. Coastal raids were a constant threat from Saxon pirates and other Germanic raiders. To control Britain, Rome concentrated their manpower in the region. Governors of Britain, as a result, held command of anywhere between 20,000 and 30,000 soldiers. In other provinces, military forces were distributed differently to cover the many thousands of kilometers of border. The Rhine frontier, as an example, deployed 8 legions at any given time. This deployment was largely along the frontier, and some concentration of their forces behind the lines. This was similar in Britain, but not to the same extent. Their militaristic actions required a rapid response to threats rather than routine surveillance of the frontier. Their forces were centralized and used to working with each other. When a British army landed in Gaul, it was not a minor rebellion, it was a credible bid for the throne. Another transformation occurred quietly over the centuries: the composition of the army itself. During the early expansionist stages of the empire, Roman legions were intentionally recruited from across the empire and deployed far from home. The purpose was to avoid rebellion and sentimental value in the military. Soldiers were less likely to rebel in a land where they had no familial connections. For example, legions raised in Spain might serve in Syria, or a unit from Gaul in Egypt. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, this system had shifted as necessity dictated. Recruitment became increasingly localized. In Britain, soldiers were no longer temporary garrisons. They had become settlers, and their families lived in the shadow of forts like Eboracum, Deva, Chester, York, and Carlion. Veterans received land upon completion of service, and often their sons followed suit. The military communities became interwoven with civilian life, and Vindolanda shows how deeply they intertwined. A locally rooted army is not simply stationed in its province, they belong to it. Their identity joins with the local customs and personalities. Should a British army proclaim an emperor, it was a regional military society acting in what it believed to be its collective interest. As a province, Britain was never fully Romanized. In Londinium, the populace urbanized and Romanized rapidly and flourished. Villas dotted the fertile lands of the south, and Roman law and language spread amongst the elites. And it should be noted that this debate is hotly contested amongst modern scholarship, and the consensus remains inconclusive. Most of Britain, however, remained rural, tribal, and importantly, culturally distinct. Romanization was largely kept to the urban centers and depended on military presence. Although legionary power was concentrated in the north, large swathes of rural Britain retained their pre-Roman Celtic culture. This was in large part due to the shallow elite integration into wider imperial politics, the limited senatorial networks compared with those in Gaul or Spain, and their existing isolation from Mediterranean aristocratic culture. Unlike Gaul, Spain, or the Near East, Britain had limited integration into Mediterranean political networks prior to the conquest. The provinces of the Mediterranean, however, were well aware of Rome long before they became integrated into the growing empire. Because of this major geographic separation, Britain lacked deep connection with Roman political life. In fully integrated provinces, rebellion risked alienating local elites, whose wealth depended on Roman control and order. In Britain, it can be argued that loyalty to Rome was often pragmatic rather than ideological. Furthermore, Britain had a history of pre-Roman tribal warfare. Authority was often personal, martial, and localized. When Roman generals declared themselves emperors, local support could be mobilized through patronage and protection, rather than an innate belief in the commander's right to rule. Ultimately, Britain produced rebellions not because it rejected Rome, but because it never became fully dependent on Rome. As a frontier province, Britain fostered a hardened military culture. Its soldiers were experienced, its commanders were accustomed to working autonomously when needed, and its units were accustomed to acting decisively. In an empire where armies created emperors, such cohesion carried political potential. They were arguably in a constant state of warfare, whether defensive or offensive. And the loyalties of the armies of frontier provinces were fluid and flimsy at the best of times. Time and again across the empire, emperors were made by their armies following particularly successful campaigns. And as soon as ill fortune befell them, they were quick to turn their swords against their leaders. The Rhine and Danube frontiers also produced emperors, such as Maximinus Thrax, Postumus, Vitellius, and Valentinian I. But these regions were adjacent to one another and tightly integrated intercontinental politics. These emperors benefited from emerging from integrated frontier networks, in which Britain functioned as an isolated military system. This is best illustrated by the Gallic and Palmyrene empires' attempts to secede from Rome, which were ultimately reincorporated into the empire by Aurelian. Britain, by contrast, was an isolated military ecosystem that fought the Picts and raiders on its own. They endured arguably harsher climates and lived in fortified regions. This fostered greater unit cohesion and loyalty to their raised emperors than in other regions. In essence, they treated it as a military promotion instead of an ideological rebellion. Another factor was Britain's economic position. While it certainly wasn't poor, it could not compare to the empire's granary in Egypt or the financial heartland of Asia Minor. It also lacked the dense and ancient wealth of Syria. This meant that Britain was both easier to lose and it was easier to seize. If there was a rebellion in Egypt, Judea, or Syria, Rome reacted instantly and with overwhelming manpower, as shown by the estimated casualty figures for the Bar Kokhba revolt under Hadrian in 132 to 136 AD. If there was one in Britain, it was assumed, or hoped, that the local legions could handle the problem, which in most cases was true. Boudica's revolt, while famous for the justified reason behind it, was famously lost at the Battle of Watling Street, which saw the outnumbered Romans emerge victorious. Tacitus's father-in-law, Gnaeus Agricola, the future governor of Britain, was on Suetonius's staff at the time. Tacitus recorded in his Life of Gnaeus Julius Agricola the speech made by the general before the battle. "Ignore the racket made by these savages. There are more women than men in their ranks. They are not soldiers. They are not even properly equipped. We have beaten them before, and when they see our weapons and feel our spirit, they will crack. Stick together. Throw the javelins and then push forward. Knock them down with your shields and finish them with your swords. Forget about plunder. Just win, and you will have everything." This was the Roman mentality towards those opposing their rule, and Britain was no different. While Britain supplied Rome with grain, lead, tin, silver, and slaves, it was not structurally indispensable to imperial survival in the same way as Egypt was. Similarly, Britain did not depend on Rome for anything. It had agricultural self-sufficiency, its own mining resources, and a dedicated coastal defense fleet in the Classis Britannica. Economically, Britain would have been viable as a breakaway province, should an ambitious commander have felt the need. Britain's insular geography provided more than just defensive depth. It granted maritime leverage. The Channel acted as both a shield and a controlled corridor. With the Classis Britannica and later Channel fleets, Britain possessed the rare ability to regulate access to its own frontier. Its value as protection cannot be understated, as immediate retaliation was nigh on impossible unless an enemy had already premeditated the venture. It also provided a controlled crossing point into Gaul. British claimants to the throne could consolidate local power before crossing into the continent. The Channel ultimately offered defensive depth, the island serving as a safe fallback. Carausius demonstrated this dramatically when he leveraged naval command to establish an independent regime. but the structural possibility existed long before him. Political instability within the empire played another important role. Many of Britain's usurpations coincided with critical moments of imperial crisis. The year of the 5 emperors, the crisis of the 3rd century, and the late fragmentation of the Western Roman Empire. When political instability and legitimacy in Rome were unclear, provincial armies often took matters into their own hands. In moments of imperial crisis, Britain's distance magnified its uncertainty. Cut off from immediate clarity and surrounded by troops who looked to them for direction, governors could present local proclamation as the safest path to stability. This is especially true by the late 4th and early 5th centuries, when the context changed again. The Western Roman Empire was no longer the dominant, stabilizing force it had once been. Barbarian confederations had been threatening the Rhine frontier for some time, and the major Rhine crossing in 406 and 407 AD was met with limited resistance. The Roman political elite's withdrawal to Ravenna to escape the empire's faltering social demands compounded this issue. Civil wars continued to drain the already depleted manpower, and imperial resources were stretched thin. This environment had allowed British claimants to assume the character of the savior. Constantine III did not come from a period of strength, but chose his moment as the West was collapsing. Across the Channel, he watched Gaul deteriorate, and the faltering imperial response to manage it effectively. Constantine III likely did not believe Rome could protect its interests any longer. In proclaiming himself emperor, and with the veteran British legions at his back, there is little doubt that he saw himself as a savior and a stabilizing presence in Western Rome. When viewed this way, Britain rebelled because it had to act, not because it wanted independence. As mentioned earlier, service in Britain was prestigious but isolating. The governors had control of a massive, high-visibility military, but limited upwards mobility, as there were few higher provincial commands than in Britain. The combination of ambition, troops, and isolation could lead to significant temptation. Figures like Clodius Albinus did not begin as rebels, but as legitimate commanders navigating unstable political environments. He initially cooperated with Septimus Severus during the year of the 5 emperors, but died in battle in 197 AD. Considering how often Britain produced imperial pretenders and successors, it began to normalize the idea that it was possible. Precedent mattered, and each successful or near-successful bid for power reinforced it. By the 4th century, Britain had developed a tradition of imperial proclamation. The pattern was established. When the Western Empire weakened, British troops followed precedent rather than innovation. It became almost expected towards the end. For centuries, Britain was a part of the empire, loyal, proud, and valuable. Britain combined military concentration, geographic seclusion, economic value, and political distance in a way no other province did simultaneously. Most provinces had a few of these traits, but not all of them. The rebellions that began in Britain, it could be argued, were because Rome built Britain too well. Rome concentrated legions in Britain to hold the edge of the known world. It empowered its commanders to secure and maintain the frontiers. To maintain social order, the military authority and political power in Britain were semi-autonomous, both by allowance and necessity. Ultimately, Britain was not Rome's weakest province. It was its most military self-sufficient, and in an empire where armies declare emperors, that made all the difference. The rebellions in Britain were not accidents of personality or charisma, but logical outcomes of geographic, militaristic, and imperial fragility. Rome may have conquered and held Britain for several centuries, but Britain repeatedly tried to return the favor. More videos on every corner of the Roman Empire are on the way, so make sure you're subscribed and press the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video. To watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.